Good afternoon, everyone. It's a pleasure to welcome you all to our ERAA webinar this afternoon on the European Resource Adequacy Assessment. Thanks everyone for your interest and for tuning in for today's session. We've quite an interesting agenda prepared for you. As always, the great number of people turning up to these ERAA webinars, and I think the numbers keep increasing for every session we have. It shows really great interest to the topic. Normally, when we introduce any ERAA workshop or webinar, we tend to say some words about the importance of the topic and link it to some policy initiatives like a recent COP event or Fit for 55 ambitions. But I think we all learned the hard way in recent weeks how important energy security is for all of our lives. So I think really this discussion again comes at a very timely moment, and thanks to all of you for participating in the discussion today. The objective of the ERAA, I think it has become more relevant than ever. We try to assess the adequacy of our system in the coming years, taking into account technical aspects, economic aspects, policy drivers, and of course everything we have seen and heard in recent weeks reshakes a bit how we look at the system. And perhaps it forces us even to look a bit beyond the business as usual. So I can only say, of course, today's debate comes at a very timely moment, and we definitely very much look forward to hearing your views on how we plan to approach the European Resource Adequacy Assessment 2022. My name is Edwin Hazen. I'm head of section on system development at ENTSO-E in Brussels. It's my pleasure to introduce all our guest speakers today and moderate the discussions with all of you. I'm pretty sure many of you have participated already in earlier workshops we had on the ERAA, possibly even the webinar we had last week on the scenario proposals for the ERAA 2022, which we plan to publish end of the year by November. So thanks all for the continued interest for this work item. Today we look a bit more at what I would call the mechanics of the ERAA, being the methodology improvements the team has been thinking about, has been suggesting, and we really look forward to hearing your reactions. Are we setting the right priorities? Is there something else which deserves attention in your view? Is something less relevant? We have quite a packed agenda, but we also have allocated time until 5 o'clock today because we really want to make sure we can capture your view, and we really see today's event as a working collaborative session with all of you. As I say too often in webinars, ideally we would have had this in a physical face-to-face environment. And of course, crossing my fingers that as of the next workshop we have on the ERAA, we can also accommodate some live face-to-face exchanges with many of you going forward. Briefly, I will run through the agenda for today. So we want to start with a few words on the previous ERAA cycle and the consultation process, explaining to you what we learned from all the feedback we received from all of you on that document. We also invited a few external organizations to share some views on what they've been thinking about, how they reviewed the ERAA 2021, and in general, anything you would see as priorities for our work going forward. Then the next block, point 3, would be about a few main elements of the ERAA 2022. A few words still about the assumptions and scenarios. We already had a good discussion with all of you last week about the main pathways we plan to look in for the ERAA 2022. We want to say a few more words about commodity prices, carbon and fuel, and again, in context of everything we heard and learned over recent weeks, I think it really comes at a timely moment to hear from you if we should look beyond that out of the box, and how we best approach the ERAA 2022 to make it an as relevant as possible exercise. Secondly, we will have some discussion about some specific modeling improvements. And thirdly, we want to talk about what is by many seen as the core engine of an ERAA, the economic viability assessment, which we plan to continuously improve in various steps throughout the years. So we want to share some thoughts about what we plan to do in the ERAA 2022 on the EVA. And again, very much appreciate views from all of you joining here today about priorities and address any questions you might have, of course. Before introducing the first speaker, perhaps we go first to a few housekeeping rules. If you can go to the next slide. I think we can just take the next one immediately, then people have the right link. Yes. As you may know from previous webinars we've organized, we definitely value your contribution, your questions, your thoughts, your reactions, etc. We will also have a few poll questions during the webinar to probe you for your reactions. We do this via the Slido app, and you find the link and the code here on the screen. I really invite you to already log into that web page, enter the code you see here on the screen, and engage throughout the session via the Slido app. I know probably you will still see a Q&A box in the GoToWebinar application, but I would really kindly ask you refrain from using that button, and anything you want to share with us, please do it via the Slido app. We had considered also having a bit more of an open discussion with some of you, but I think given the large number of people we have, we're almost at 100 people here, we keep as house rules to keep microphones closed, at least for the participants. Feel free to react definitely via the Slido app, and we'll see how the conversation goes. We could still adapt and perhaps have a bit of a discussion later on during the webinar. Also good to emphasize, today's webinar will be recorded, just so you're aware of it. It's just to facilitate the understanding and onboarding of people who could not join today, and for everyone's view later on if they wish to do so, of course. You will soon after the webinar find a link on the ENTSO-E web page where you can find a recording of today's event. Last point I would say is still on the Slido app. Definitely, please do engage, please do react. I would only kindly ask you, whenever you make any statement, it can be a statement, it can be a question, any kind of reaction, appreciate it if you do provide your name and affiliation, so at least we understand who the question comes from. We know if you have many questions during the event, and we could even get back to you, of course, after today's webinar. There is no filtering on the contributions. Anything you provide will be visible to all the other participants, but I think it's in the interest of everyone if you know who the reaction comes from. And as always, of course, you can look at the contributions, questions from other participants, click on the button to upvote them, so we also have an immediate view if there are some common questions or thoughts from the audience, and we can pick them first in the Q&A session afterwards. So please, I hope by the time we kept the number for quite a bit on the screen here, I hope you all had a chance at least to connect via the Slido app. Okay, we have a packed agenda, so I will keep it at this in terms of welcome words, and I'm happily passing on the word now to Mr. Gerald Kendler, who is the chairman of our System Development Committee, to give a few introductory remarks. Gerald, the floor is yours.
Edwin, thank you very much. And we are talking about the ERA 2022 today. And ERA is an abbreviation, and every word is really important. European Resource Adequacy Assessment. I think while there is a war on the European continent, European cooperation is more than important than ever. And we also know that looking at the things country by country is not sufficient anymore. We have to look at it in European scale. Resources, in the past we optimized them. Today we have to look if they are actually available. So we are running into new scarcity situations, which we did not know for many years. So there again, the adequacy assessment becomes more important than ever. And we completed successfully the ERA 2021. And the first, as Edwin said, the first part will be also to hear your views. And of course, one of our lessons learned is to engage earlier. And this is why we're having those webinars now earlier. It's the second process. So we also have a little more time, and we are very much welcoming your views. The next part will be about the ERA 2022 principles and where we want to improve, where we want to change. But here I'd also like to hear your view. What is important in the light of the scarcity situations we are facing today? So any views, comments on that are really important. From my perspective, it could be that we have to refocus here and there to really take into account the situation we are facing today. And one thing that we are facing, I think we see a much higher uncertainty. And then we have to see how we are going to reflect the uncertainty, and we are going to see resource restrictions, and together this resource restrictions uncertainty has to be looked up together to get a good product. And at the end, the product is to help to support policymakers, the industry, all of us, to look in how secure the energy system and the energy future in Europe will be. So therefore, I know that's a little bit grave words, but I think it is a very important situation. And here I would like to pass on the floor back to Edwin. Edwin is going to lead us through the event. And a big thank you for everyone who tunes in, and please let us know your views about the questions Ira just raised, as well as the normal ERA contributions. And Edwin, please lead us through the afternoon.
Thank you, Garrett. I think every word you said is definitely a good reminder of the importance of the work being done by the whole team. And thanks for emphasizing those points again. I will, without further ado, let you all dive into the first item of our agenda. I think we can skip a few slides, and I would pass on the floor then to Christoph Slurs, who is the convener of the ERA project team. First of all, to reflect on what we learned from the first cycle, the ERA 2021, and how we took into account the feedback we received from many of you in that process, how the team digests all of that. Christoph, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Edwin. And I really hope you can all hear me fine, because I have some connection issues apparently. So please give me a sign if it's not the case.
Will do, but for the moment we hear you fine, Christoph. No worries.
That's great. Great. So thanks for the floor. So I'll indeed quickly go through, because I won't spend too much time on this part, but quickly go through the main stakeholder feedback we got following ERA 2021. As you know, probably we organized a public consultation after we published ERA 2021 in order to get your feedbacks, and of course we'll also take it into account into also what we present today as improvements towards ERA 2022. So basically there were four, we could say, big categories of feedback, and I think we can all say that most feedbacks we received regarding the economic viability assessment, economic assumptions, and everything surrounding that part of the analysis. And this is also part upon which we will spend some time today further on in this webinar on presenting you some of these improvements linked to those feedbacks. Secondly, on the modeling of cross-border interconnections, flow-based, where we got indeed feedbacks on the consideration of flow-based in the central scenarios. There, I can reassure you that at least for core, for ERA 2022, we will indeed include a flow-based assessment in the central scenarios. Then thirdly, more general feedback, let's say, on unit commitment, other proposals for quality improvements, these kind of things there as well. We'll spend some time on those today, presenting you some of the improvements on that matter that we intend to implement for ERA 2022. And then last but not least, relating also to the webinar we had last week, we received a number of more country-specific comments, more on the input data, on the input hypothesis. And there, indeed, so we organized a call for evidence and a webinar last week, presenting you some of the input data overviews. At the same time, we also published the data on the website and launched a call for evidence, which is still opened, and for which I still invite you again today to bring us your feedback on the input data that will be used for ERA 2022 as well. Next slide, please. So digging a little bit deeper into more specific priorities on specific topics for stakeholders to improve in the ERA assessment. And here on the slide we show, let's say, two large teams. On the left side you have the more general improvements in the ERA. On the right side we focus more on the EVA analysis. To start with the general improvements, of which quite a lot of them will indeed be touched upon today and later in this webinar. We got, let's say, messages, questions to improve the analysis of the results, to improve the accounting of electrolysis in the system, DSR modeling, demand-side response, which is of course also a very hot and important topic nowadays. The target years, where indeed we started last year with 2 target years, 2025 and 2030, which will stepwise need to be increased towards all 10 years of the 10-year horizon. So this is also a topic that will be addressed. And last but not least, on plant maintenance, where indeed we also intend to make some improvements in order to have a even more realistic representation of the plant maintenance of notably centralized generation resources throughout Europe. On the right-hand side, so on the key topic of economic viability assessment, there it was last year, the first time that we implemented this EVA in the ERA, and of course we all agree that there's still quite some improvements to be made. So we just listed some of the aspects of this EVA upon which we got quite some stakeholder feedback, and which were mentioned as a priority for stakeholders in order to be improved. Which is first of all, of course, implementing a multi-year EVA, taking into account different, let's say, time horizons, different years in the assessment, as of course in reality also these kinds of capacities of assets will remain in service for multiple years and will be able to get revenues for multiple years. Stochastic EVA, so the way in which we implemented the economic viability assessment, which is of course still a simplified way. This is also something that we will dig further into in order to improve and have a more representative output of this assessment. And then thirdly, regarding investment candidates, where there was, of course, in the first iteration still a limited set of technologies that were considered for investments in the EVA. There as well, we got the feedback to try to increase this set of investment candidates to cover, let's say, the whole scale of potential technologies that could be invested in this system. I think that was a very short overview of the feedback we got from stakeholders. After the public consultation, we also published a stakeholder report on the ENTSO-E website, so I can always invite you to take a look if you'd be further interested. But of course, the biggest part of the webinar today will also be about explaining how we intend to tackle these different methodological improvements in the ERA to come. I think that was it for my very short overview. I don't know, Edwin, if you take the floor again.
Yes, thank you, Christoph, for at least reflecting on the consultation we had a few months ago. Further improvement, it was always part of the plan. Many of you may have seen the first ERA roadmap we published, when was it, over a year ago. And if you've paid careful attention, you've seen that the improvements, the gradual improvements we had planned for the coming ERA editions have evolved as well because of additional insights the team had in the first ERA 2021, but also because of feedback we received from many stakeholders, from Acer, from member states, etc. So it really helps to have a discussion about where to further improve. At least you see here the main summaries we took from the consultation feedback. It definitely helped us to confirm and where needed adapt our own roadmap. But definitely we plan to go into the different bubbles or boxes in today's webinar, talk about how we could approach them, and definitely again very much key if you can hear if this goes in the right direction or if you see other priorities. I don't see any immediate question in the Slido app about what you just presented, Christoph. If there's any reaction on that, again, I invite people to at least share it with us. But again, for the sake of time, I would suggest we indeed then already go to the next parts of the agenda where we talk about looking forward. This was a bit looking backwards. Now we look forward what can or should be done in the ERA 2022. We invited a few stakeholder organizations and other entities to start with some opening remarks about how they look at the ERA objective, about how the methodology could be addressed, about what they took from the ERA 2021, what they responded in our own consultation a few weeks ago. I think it's good to at least again ask them to share their thoughts before we initiate the discussion about ideas for the next ERA 2022, which we had in mind, and definitely we need to reflect, of course, on those statements going further. We've invited 3 organizations to give some opening statements. I would ask all of them to at least give a short presentation of about, I would say, 10 minutes max. I ask you kindly to stick to that. And definitely also I would ask anyone attending today's webinar to also ask questions to them, of course, for proper understanding. So first of all, I pass the floor to Dimitri Perakotsev from Compass Lexicon, who takes part in an interesting study together with a few other consultancies for a few member states about the possible improvements for adequacy assessments. But I'm not going to explain what your study is about, Dimitri. I'm going to let you explain, of course, why you're doing this study, and especially, of course, looking forward to hear your views about how especially the economic viability assessment could go forward for the next edition and for the coming years. We can aim very high, of course, but appreciate to hear your view of what is realistic and what could eventually be possible in many years to come. So pass on the floor to yourself, Dimitri. Thanks.
Good. Thank you, Edwin. Good afternoon, everyone. So in this next 20 minutes, I will present you briefly the status of our study. So together with two other consultancies, R2B, Guidehouse, we at Compass Lexicon are working with Pentalateral Forum on the methodological improvements of the resource adequacy assessments. And today I'll mostly focus on the work package that concerns the economic viability assessment methodologies. This slide presents you the overview of the entire project, which basically shows that it's not only about economic viability assessment, we also work on other elements such as methodologies to determine DSR potential, work package 2, understanding the minimum standards and the best practices of data requirements, that's work package 1, assessment of the climate change impact on the resource adequacy, and that's work package 5, scientific evaluation of extreme scenarios in the scope of resource adequacy, and that's work package 5. And in addition to these topics, we also have implemented a number of workshops to accompany each of the 5 work packages. So if we go to the next slide, this one focuses more on the content and the objectives of the work package 3 that focuses on the economic viability assessment. The objective is to evaluate different approaches of the economic viability assessment for power plants, storage facilities, flexibility assets in the framework of resource adequacy assessment. The whole work package and the study consists of several parts where we want to assess the existing gaps in the current EVA approaches, address the political constraints on, practical constraints of the EVA modeling, address the how the market signals together with policy targets and subsidies are impacting the decisions to enter or exit the market that are modeled within the EVA, and also to address the modeling of the strategic decisions that take into account the risks as part of the entry and exit decisions. All along this project, which started in May last year, we have also performed 2 series of workshops. The first 2 expert workshops were organized in June of last year, and the other 2 workshops were held actually a couple of days ago in March this year. The objective of the first workshops in last summer was to get the inputs from the industry representatives about the drivers of the capacity entry and exit decisions. We wanted to make sure that when we develop the approaches for EVA, we do this in a close link to how the industry takes these decisions. And so we asked a number of questions and discussed the points about what revenues across different markets are important for entry and exit decisions. what are the different constraints and policy risks that are taken into account. And in the second series of workshops this March, we focused on more specific points. And in the next couple of slides, I will present you some findings of these workshops. On this slide, we see the main conclusions from the first workshops. It is summarized in the two columns separating conventional plans and flexibility developments, because we have found out in the discussion with the market participants that there is a quite a different set of drivers for the entry and exit decisions for these two categories of capacity resources, even though within each capacity resource class, there are certainly further details. So, for example, we understand that conventional plants are, and their decisions to enter or exit the market are much driven by the wholesale markets and the revenues in these markets. Ancillary service and balancing markets and the revenues received there are taken into account with a lot of conservatism. Capacity mechanisms and capacity markets, if they exist, can be a key factor for the entry and exit decisions. And of course, for plants that have CHP capabilities, the revenues coming from outside of electricity sector, the heat revenues, could play a key role. With respect to the risk, the conventional plants are, and the investors are usually risk averse. They tend to make their decisions based on the central scenario and not be driven too much by low probability but potentially high revenue scenarios. And the situation is quite different for flexibility development. Here we're talking about storage operators, demand side response, and aggregators. The revenues they currently receive from the wholesale markets are not that significant as compared to the rest, and what is important for them is the combination of revenues across a number of different markets, including ancillary services and balancing markets. Capacity mechanisms is very important for them to make decisions to develop or not. And what's even more interesting is that not only the theoretical revenues are important, but the regulatory and market design elements of these markets, which define to what extent different capacity assets can have access to the markets. These assets are also quite dependent on the explicit and implicit subsidies, and investors, unlike the conventional plans, are often more risk-seeking than risk-averse, partly because capacity is quicker to mobilize and at lower investment costs. Let's move to the next slide. Yeah. The other more specific point of discussion we had in the more recent workshops was about the methodological choice between the two Eva options. So the two EVA options that are proposed by Acer. One is the EVA of individual capacity resources. That's where you estimate explicitly the revenues across different markets and model the decision of the different capacity resources to enter or exit the market based on these revenues. The second option is EVA through minimization of the system cost. That's the option wherein you model the optimal capacity entry or exit simultaneously for a number of capacity options based on the minimization overall system costs across investments and operation. We had discussed pros and cons of the two different options. For example, the first option focuses on market revenues and closer represents the point of view of capacity operators, but it may have limited opportunities to consider all the investment and retirement combinations, whereas the second option could be better in considering all the combinations and of investments and retirements across zones and capacity resources, but it has a central planner point of view, and because of different simplifications that are necessary to make the computation possible, it may overlook some elements of the actual revenue streams. So the discussion that we had was very interesting on those two elements, and the overall conclusion that came out of this discussion is that the first option could probably be more appropriate to assess the disequilibrium situations in the markets in the medium term, whereas the second option could be more appropriate to consider a long-term market equilibrium and potentially could be used in combination with option one if necessary to consider for the medium-term disequilibrium situations. And I will conclude by the last slide. Another element of the EVA that we have discussed recently is the consistency between the EVA framework and the rest of resource adequacy. We discussed the fact that although the economic dispatch focuses on the model years and the accurate estimation of the adequacy parameters, LOLI and ENS, and that requires, of course, careful estimation of the uncertainties that drive the adequacy issues in the given target years, the weather-related demand and renewable profiles, outages. The framework of the EVA might be slightly different, for example, because we are estimating in EVA the investment and retirement decisions that are driven by expected future revenues. So time frame of the EVA could be quite different from the time frame of the resource adequacy, and the uncertainty drivers may not have to be the same exactly as in ED. Some weather-related drivers might be less important, and other drivers such as commodity prices could be more important, which may require in the EVA considering not just single commodity price scenario, but a number of different scenarios. So for the sake of time, I think it's good to stop here. I hope that gives you the sense of the discussions we held during this project on the EVA. Edwin.
Thank you, Dimitri. Thanks for giving the short overview of the progress you made in your studies so far, where you're at the moment. Just from my understanding, when does the study will be concluded? Because it's still work in progress.
Yes, it's still work in progress. I think we are planning to come up with the final results before summer.
Okay, very timely. Thanks. I would definitely also invite the next two speakers to reflect on what Dimitri has just said, because without oversimplifying things, I think one of them has a lot of experience in the conventional assets, and the other one more in the flexibility development, as you had categorized the two families, Dimitri. But perhaps before we go to the next speakers, definitely invite questions from the audience, so Dimitri at least can immediately react to them. I see one question. I'm not sure if it's a question to Dimitri or towards ENTSO-E, but perhaps I bounce the question to Dimitri for his immediate reactions. The question is do you intend to model the effect of regulatory measures to tax profits earned by inframarginal generators? Before, let me just bounce to you, Dimitri. Is this one of the elements you had in the scope of your assessments on whether it is one of the
promotion generators.
You mentioned a few interesting drivers to take into account in additional to understand the investment appetite of two classes of assets. Is this something you have looked into as well in your study?
Well, we're looking into, in general, how to take into account whatever are the non-market driven elements of the drivers of the investment, subsidies, and seems like here we're talking about, well, the negative of the subsidies. So something that takes the revenue back from the market revenues. I guess this probably would impact some quite specific technology classes. I can think about some policies for nuclear generators and nuclear taxes. In general, in any case, for nuclear, it would most likely not be part of the EVA because these are policy-driven technologies, and they're usually not considered as part of EVA. But I'll make a note on it to make sure that we reflect both positive and negative subsidies in the.
It has an impact, of course, and if there's uncertainty inherent, it definitely impacts the appetite for investment. Just from my own understanding, Dimitri, you also mentioned two approaches of how to perform an EVA as allowed for via the Acer methodology. Let me call it the decentralized approach, the investor perspective, and you call it the central planner approach. You said one is more suitable for midterm, one more for the long term. The ERA, of course, focuses on the coming 10 years. Would you thereby say option one is up to 10 years the most relevant approach? Or would you say somehow in the coming 10 years you go from midterm to long term? What's your definition of midterm and long term?
Yeah. I think this was part of the discussion. It's not in our conclusion yet, but the discussion we had earlier this week was quite interesting, where several academic experts mentioned that because we are looking at adequacy study to identify potential disequilibrium situations, missing money situations, it's important to look at this through the medium-term perspective using the first option. And by medium term, we think about the time frame of the resource adequacy, 10 years. If we want to look at longer time horizon, I don't know, 2050, 2040, understand the decarbonization scenarios in general, that's where what was mentioned by the experts, the cost minimization approach is more applicable because the objective would be quite different. It's not to look at the market disequilibrium, but rather to find the equilibrium.
Okay, that's where you make the line or the gray area between midterm and long term.
It's a gray area, but also we've been discussing that if we had full, infinite computational capacity, it would make probably no difference what option you would apply. Each of those two options could have been fine-tuned to have sufficient details to replicate the same exact model. But since we need to make some sacrifice and simplifications because of the computational limits, those simplifications still allow maintaining the investor focus in the first option, but may introduce some biases of the central planner's perspective in the second option.
Yeah. Okay. Perhaps one last question I would still ask you, Dimitri, because you mentioned a bit about the drivers taken into account by investors if they make their own investment decision. You mentioned, I think it's on the other slide, if you can perhaps go to that one. The previous one, I think it was.
Two slides before. One before,
yeah. You talk a lot about appetite for investment and different market segments to take into account, risk averse, risk seeking, but you haven't really spoken about the actual methodology about how this could be applied. We'll talk about it anyway later on about the improvements we plan to make in our own EVA. The sky is the limit, but the limit is probably somewhere a bit lower than the sky if you take into account we need to deliver an ERA in the coming year already. Your own assessment on this, how realistic is it to take all those elements into account in an EVA? I do understand, everyone here understands, of course, from an investor perspective, all these certainties and additional layers of revenue or taxation are important. What is realistic, you think, in actually running a pan-European EVA?
Well, it depends on if we want to replicate the investors' decisions. I think we may need to look carefully at what they say and how they take their decisions. And here, it's quite important, seems to be what capacity resource we're talking about. In case of flexibility resources that have a lot shorter investment cycle, we have seen several market players that say that, look, we just take a look at the market prices today. We expect this will be the same or similar in the next couple of years, and if the market signals look good, we go in, because this is a very short-term investment. From the conventional plant operators, the situation is totally different. Investment cycle is long. They make projections of the wholesale prices. They include the capacity markets in their calculation of the decisions with a lot of attention, and they care mainly about the central scenario with certain risk aversion. So we really need to, when trying to model this, to try to, as much as possible, take on board this actual decision process of the investors.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Dimitri. I noticed also on the slide though where we had a few additional questions coming in. Thanks for everyone for reflecting on the subject matter and bouncing relevant questions. I have the impression that the questions are not so much, perhaps I'm misreading it, apologies for that, but directly related to what you have mentioned, Dimitri, but more about how the ERA models, how the ERA methodology itself works. I think we also covered some of those items already in previous discussions. So perhaps I would suggest we park those questions at the moment, but keep them in mind for the later on discussion when we talk about the EVA methodology itself. I think it's more relevant at that stage in time. Okay, then thanks again, Dimitri. Thanks also for staying with us. I would still appreciate if you could reflect on everything else which is being presented later on. Looking forward, of course, to the outcome of your study together with your colleagues. Then I suggest we go to our next external speaker, Yvon Rocher from Euroelectric. We have for a long time been constructively debating with Euroelectric about what an ERA is about, what's the value of it, how it could be done. Your association has also been very active in the ERA 2021 development and consultation process. Thanks for all the valuable feedback you provided, Yvon and colleagues. So I pass on the floor to you to share some views about what you see as the value of an ERA, and specifically about how an EVA should be done. Yvon, please go ahead.
Yes, thank you, Edwin, and thank you for inviting Euroelectric in this workshop. And indeed, it's a very important tool, this ERA exercise. It contributes to ensure security of electricity supply. And of course, the aim is really to highlight the potential for future adequacy issues. It's based on a variety of things, and the energy policy choice of the different member states, the expected evolutions of demand, the expected evolution of supply. And in this context, it's clear that stakeholders' involvement is key. And it's really appreciated to have those exchanges with you over the last years, and for sure in the coming years as well. Of course, it's a difficult exercise. Of course, it's a difficult exercise, and on our side, we rely on a set of members to provide input and to challenge the study. So If we focus first on the ERAA 2021 and give again a general assessment, one of the elements that we believe would be important to develop is really the sensitivity analysis of the results. And one of the reasons is basically it's a very complex model. It's a difficult exercise. It needs assumptions on the data for the existing, the future capacity. It also requires assumptions on the model parameters, like for the flow-based market coupling, also for the EVA. But since we don't have access to the model, it's extremely difficult to assess somehow the sensitivity of the results to some of the key assumptions or the key parameters. So that's why having a strengthened analysis of sensitivities would be useful. When we look at, for instance, the low thermal capacity, with the impression is that it was a bit lacking ambitions, in the sense that you could have more aggressively reflect, in fact, the goals, the 2030 goals, the impact of the Fit for 55, also the recent pledge for earlier phase out of coal and lignite units in Germany. And of course, I guess that for the future exercise, you will also have to reflect on the current situations and what could be the evolutions of the power system once you take those elements on board. But it's really trying to anticipate in the sensitivity how things could deviate from your base case. Then that's for the general aspects. And I think the next slide is more focused on the economic viability assessment. And there, I think you already mentioned, I think it was you, Edwin, or maybe was it Christophe, that you're planning to extend the economic viability assessments much beyond a single year, as it was done before. And that's clearly important, because we need really a trajectory of for this exercise, because when you take an investment decisions, it's not only for 1 year, it's for multiple years. So at least for the duration of the ERA, at least for 10 years in this case, for depending on the kind of assets, of course. It's also, so it's true for new investment, but it's also true for refurbishment of units. So this is really important to move from a single year EVA to multiple year EVA. Another reason is that a decision that you would take in 2025 would also impact the capacity that would be, or that could be available in the future years. So even if it could, the system could still work in 2025, for instance, it might be that in 2026, 2027, you would not need this asset in place, and this could be one of the best option, or the least costly option. Of course, it's a modeling exercise. It has limitation, but still, it's important to understand how things are working. And I think also linked to the previous slide, what is important when assumptions are being made, it's related to the economics that are behind. And of course, for renewable capacities, you have renewable targets and support mechanism, and this could drive the investment somehow. For in other cases, like demand side response or storage, you don't have those kind of mechanism. And then the question is, when you have scenarios for the development of demand side response, the development of storage, are they economically viable? What is the economic rationale behind? And this is also that might be lacking a bit in the analysis. Of course, as I mentioned already, there are some parameters in all those features of the model, and one of them, for instance, is the very high scarcity price, where basically you would have a price going up to 15,000 euro per megawatt-hour. I think you're making a sensitivity analysis on this, but indeed the question is, what if those price cannot be achieved for several reasons? What if the modeling assumptions, the assumptions that are embedded in the model, cannot realize in practice? How would it impact the EV analysis? How would it impact the revenues? And would you still make the same decisions in the economic analysis? And then the last point is also related to how things are being done for the EVA analysis. I think what was mentioned in the report was that it's a kind of iterative process where you solve the problem, and then you adjust the capacity, and then you run the model, and then you loop on this. And we believe that having probably a comprehensive formulation where you add this possibility to invest or to divest in existing capacity, depending on their economic viability, would be more efficient and would allow to make more efficient arbitrage between the different options, and could prove, let's say, more interesting also for getting some results. So those are basically the comments, the high-level comments that we have. I think that on Eurelectric website you can find all the comments, including the country comments that we share with ENTSO-E and also with ASR for the consultation that was also launched earlier by ASR. Voilà.
Thanks, Yvonne. Thanks for sharing that, not only in this presentation here, of course, but also the more extensive document to which you just referred. Our team has been looking at it carefully, and also definitely for the national comments. Those are being picked up by our national TSO members, of course. I'm still keeping track of the questions we have on Slido. If anyone has any questions towards Yvonne, please do raise them via the Slido app. Again, apologies if I'm misreading the questions, but I think the questions we see so far are mostly directed towards ENTSO-E, how we plan to tackle them in the ERA 2022. So perhaps I will ask the colleagues to reflect on them either in the discussion later on, or the colleagues already providing answers in writing in the Slido app, but at least they're definitely being noted. We plan to come back to each and every one of them. Perhaps a few questions to yourself, Yvonne, while we're looking at this slide. Assumptions on very high scarcity prices. It is a key assumption, especially if you talk about the viability of entry or exits, of course. There are approaches of how to do it, but even more refined in the ERA 2022, and we'll come back to that later in this webinar. Can I just ask the view of, I mean, your members in general, if you can say anything about it? If investments or exits are being considered, do you normally count on the assumption of high scarcity prices, or do you believe they will never materialize? Like we're seeing discussions at the moment, high prices. We all read the communication from the Commission of last week, where there are some interesting sentences in there. The interventions and market prices may be needed to shield consumers from negative impacts. So, your opinion, Yvonne, should we as ENTSO-E assume high scarcity prices, or should we assume a reality check where they probably might not materialize? What's the best approach if one of the two is to be chosen?
I think it's a difficult question, because indeed, if you remember the debate, there are some people that believe that, for instance, in the energy-only market would trigger very high prices and those during scarcity events, and then at the end of the day, this would allow investments to materialize. And of course, you would need either very often, let's say, small price spikes, or more rarely very high price spike price. And then there are other member states that believe that in practice it's not able to incentivize sufficiently the investments, and then indeed for these reasons they have been putting capacity mechanism, capacity markets in place, because they don't believe that with price spikes, you can incentivize the capacity that is needed to ensure the security of supply at the right level. So there are different views on this, of course. But then once you enter this into this ERAA exercise, of course, the difficult part is that it will also drive let's say the assessment of whether a capacity market could be needed or not. And then it's important to also take into account that some of the assumptions that are taken in the modeling, and for a model, it's no problem to a very high price. It's no problem to cut the load during some hours. But in practice, in real life, okay, this is important. So I don't have really an answer, but I think it's important to reflect on the fact that a modeling exercise has some limitation. It represents somehow what could be happening. The question is, will it materialize in practice? And what would be the risk in terms of security of supply if those assumptions do not materialize? And I think that's also one of the reasons why it's important to have this sensitivity analysis and to make sure that people understand in a correct way what are the limitations also of the outcome of this kind of analysis.
Thanks, Yvon. I think I would still split the last argument you gave in two steps. What is the risk if you go on one assumption, and then investments happen based on the action taken based on that, and another measure is taken in the actual markets, which jeopardizes some investments, and then you have a security of supply risk, or which initial assumption you should have taken, of course. Yeah. I think
yes, indeed, you could make this split, and probably it also makes clear what is on the modeling side and what is on the let's say policy side or regulatory side.
The risk of having taken an unfortunate assumption. I think that's what we're coming to. Yeah. Okay, good. I think the colleagues here are still moderating the questions and then responding already directly to some of them being posed. Unless somebody gives me a nudge that one of the questions here was directly directed to you, Yvon, I would say thanks a lot for your presentation here. Also hope you can stay with us for the rest of the debate. I'm looking forward to your reactions to everything being shared and discussed later on in this session. And then we move on to our third external speaker, Andres Pintobello from Smarten, the association representing the industry on flexible solution, including demand response. Has of course been one of the key items discussed in the first ERA edition 2021. Christophe already highlighted it as one of the areas we definitely are keen to work on to further improve and enrich in the 2022 edition. So looking forward to the views from your sector, Andres, about which realistic projections do exist and what you believe we should best take into account for the next edition of the ERA. Thanks for being with us, and I pass on the word to you, Andres.
Thank you, Edwin, and thank you for inviting us and having us here in this workshop. I think it's a great testament to the work that you do, that you also want to include us in these efforts. Just in the interest of time, I will skip the introduction on Smarten and just move on to the first slide. Exactly. So no, you can skip this one as well. I think everybody can see me. So just as a short introduction, we did recently from Smarten an exercise to understand what the involvement of demand-side resources are in existing resource adequacy mechanisms in Europe. I won't go into the details on this report because I don't think they're relevant, or the outcomes are not extremely relevant at this for this study. But I think it is important to understand the current involvement of demand-side response to be able to properly assess its potential in future modeling, for reasons that I will explain a bit more later. And I mean, the main takeaways are that that demand response is currently not very present in these resource adequacy mechanisms. The reasons for that, you can of course have a look at the report to better understand, but it makes it knowing this involvement makes it, or not knowing this involvement, not taking it into account, it makes it quite challenging to accurately forecast what the potential participation of a demand response will be in the future. And on top of that, market design plays a very important function in bringing out the available flexibility. Many times it remains hidden since the consumer is not really aware of what the possibilities are until a market exists for them, or an aggregator reaches out to them. So these flexibilities, they just remain hidden, and which makes it even more complex to calculate the availability of demand response in future resource adequacy mechanisms. So this on the importance to really understand the status quo when trying to engage in different modeling exercises. And if we move onto the next slide, which is more focused on the ERA 2022 suggestions, and based also on the improvements that we saw could be made from the ERA 2021. We would like these reflections on the current situations of the markets to be included in this modeling, or we see this as important. As already mentioned, there's a risk that by assuming that the current status of demand response is what it is, and extrapolating that capacity into the modeling, future modeling, is that we arrive at a wrong assumption, right? That we are undervaluing the possibilities of demand side resources in resource adequacy. And one of the challenges that we find is that the data available is quite limited. There's not a real knowledge out there on what the current the benefits or the costs are involved for demand DRs to be involved in these mechanisms, and it makes it even more challenging then to compare them to traditional generation, and how to and how to perform cost benefit analysis, and how to include that in the different modeling scenarios. And I was asked also to reflect a bit on the availability of flexibility in different price bands, and how to include that in the modeling scenarios. That is quite a tricky question. First, because of what I was saying before on the available flexibility, or the hidden flexibility that we don't know about, because there isn't a market already for them. So it is a bit of a chicken and egg problem, of course. But not only that, for many providers of flexibility, from our experience, and particularly maybe industrial consumers or large energy consumers, or even on the commercial setting maybe, in most cases they don't know themselves their short-run marginal costs, which could be used to compare them to the different price bands and see how much flexibility would be available. From my experience, what I've seen is that in most cases they adapt their dispatch capacity based on estimations on how long they can turn off or delay their processes without incurring into trouble themselves. And then at that point, they just take advantage of the available price at any given time and shut off or postpone their processes for that amount of time. But it is rather linked to it's not really that much linked to the existing prices, but rather on their schedules and activities, I would say. So that makes it a bit tricky to really understand what or the potential flexibility is at any given price point, let's say. And then the other point or challenge that we saw is that makes it very difficult to compare these different types of resources are the price structures. No, can you go still on the previous slide, please? Yeah. So the price structures for demand response or demand side flexibility are just not the same than traditional generation. And I think this is something that we really need to think about how to tackle that in future modeling exercises. I don't have myself a solution right now, but I think that this is a conversation that we need to have somehow. I have some suggestions maybe on how we could approach this later on in the last slides, but it's not written in stone for us either. But in the meantime, on suggestions, since we risk, due to the limitations that we have, we risk significantly undervaluing these technologies. I think we need to have scenarios that are more ambitious in the targets, both on the already available technologies, so heat pumps, industrial loads, even electric vehicles, but also the developments that and how we project these technologies to develop in the future. And this is something that I saw somewhat missing in the ERA 2021, where for a good reason probably, but that the assumptions were more conservative on some technologies where we see that the development in 10 years is going to be quickly outpacing these assumptions. And also to facilitate other parties like ourselves in properly assessing whether assumptions are reasonable or not, I think it's quite important to increase the available information to the public. In particular, I mean, I'm talking here about the dispatched bits and the technologies that are behind them, and the compositions of different pools of these bits. So to really understand who is actually participating and to see if projections of participation in the future would be in line with these with the current reality. And then finally, maybe just as an exercise, to include scenarios that factor in a change in product design and rules and regulation and requirements, to see the impact that it would have in really unlocking this use of distributed resources. Because sometimes, and from what we've seen, we take regulation as a given in the current regulatory status as a given in modeling exercises, but there's a very high likelihood that it will change over the past years, over the next years. So it will also change the outcomes of these modeling exercises. And now if we go to the next slide, of course, I mean, we do have some suggestions or we see a lot of things that could be improved, but we're also ourselves doing a bit the exercise to see how we can support these modeling exercises and how we can or what information we can provide ourselves from the industry side. And at Smarten, we're currently working on a study together with the consultancy DNV. It should be published in September this year. And we're trying to quantify the benefits and the potential of demand-side flexibility in the whole energy system. So not only resource adequacy, but in general. And the challenges that we faced and why we wanted to do this study are linked to the ones I was mentioning before, the lack of real understanding of what potential we have and how to compare it to other technologies, and of course how to include it in these modeling scenarios. So the metrics that we're going to be looking at, we have 4 main metrics. We're assuming that the targets for decarbonization will be achieved in 2030, and based on that, we will be looking at what the potential capacity for demand-side flexibility will be by 2030, assuming that we reach these targets. The amount of demand-side flexibility that needs to be activated to reach these targets, and then the benefits both at system level, so system level savings, and also the benefits for the end user in economic terms, what these are. And when I'm talking about end user benefits, I'm talking for both those that activate flexibility and those that don't have flexibility themselves, but are benefiting from lower wholesale prices, or for example, thanks to the available flexibility. And if you go to the next slide, I have a short example of what the metrics are that we're or the input data that we're collecting right now. This is just a snapshot for one technology for industrial loads. As you can see, we're looking into all different industries, different processes, the different activation times and duration that they can provide, and the current capacity and the projected capacity. But this is only a snapshot on these technologies. We're looking really at all currently available technologies, also some that might be available more broadly in the future, like V2G. But this is the main input or technologies that we are currently looking at. And the markets that we're looking into focusing on are, so first on the benefits on the wholesale markets and adequacy mechanisms, but then also on the impact on balancing prices, the impact on infrastructure needs for further capital investments, etc. So this is a bit of an overview of what we're doing right now, and I'm happy to share any preliminary results with you, with the ENTSO-E team once, if they are useful for the ERA and for your modeling exercises. But other than that, I think in September we will have more detailed information for you. That's all from my side. I don't know if there are any questions.
Thanks, Andreas, for sharing the views from your sector and the interesting work you're embarking on. Definitely looking forward to the report and intermediate results before September, of course. I don't know if there's any questions towards Andreas on whatever he presented. Just keeping an eye again on the Slido web. I have the impression there are many very good questions, also very detailed methodological questions being posed, but I have the impression they more focus on what we plan to do in the ERA as such. I'm not immediately capturing anything directed to you, Andres. Okay. In any case, I mean, I think it's we definitely have to take stock of everything you just mentioned, Andres. There's nobody who will ignore there is a vast potential for demand flexibility in the future energy system. Regardless of if you look at decarbonization or security of supply, it's something we have to tap into, of course. But it is damn hard to assess which are the specific parameters, how to include them into a modeling exercise. So thanks for openly stating that even many demand response providers are still trying to identify which are the actual activation prices they should actually take into account. And there's still some work ahead to assess a nice inventory. Let me call it an inventory of demand response potential across Europe, and you're doing it in a very structured way. We will definitely reflect on the topic of demand response in the later part of the webinar. No surprise, it came up quite prominently also in the feedback on the consultation process of ERA 2021. I would definitely definitely ask you, Andres, to share your thoughts on what you present next. We of course had various exchanges already over the recent months with your organizations, but appreciate your views on the pros and cons, the priorities we set for implicit and explicit demand response later on in this webinar. Thanks again for your presentation, and hope, of course, you can stay with us for the rest of the discussion. Okay. Thanks also to everyone dialed in to follow the discussion and for actively contributing with questions on the Slido. The team here is busy with already trying to react to as many of them as possible on the fly. I don't think we will have a possibility to discuss all of them in depth during the webinar. But if there's anything the colleagues would like to add on some of the questions, they can definitely do, of course, during the next parts of the presentation. Okay, then I would suggest we move on to the next part of our webinar. If you can move on to the next one. Next one, please. Yes. Previous one. Yes. Before we talk about the modeling improvements and the specific EVA methodology aspects the team has been working on, we want to address a few key elements of the ERA scenario assumptions, specifically on commodity prices. And before I pass the floor to Christophe to share a few suggested ideas which the team has been working on, let us start by first probing the views of the audience here. We have about 100 people here. Somebody told me something about wisdom of the crowds a long time ago, so I'm curious to hear which common directions we get from the people here on the line. I think the first poll question is open as well. We need to make an assumption or several assumptions. Even if you talk about sensitivities, something has to be chosen about carbon price trajectories in the coming decade because we look 10 years ahead. So I'm looking forward to feedback from everyone here on the first question we have in our poll. What are your expectations for the carbon price trajectory in the coming decade? 4 general assumptions. I'm not asking people to pick a specific number, but more trends, directions. First option, a slight drop in coming years, and then we rise again. Second option, starting from the current price with a slow, steady increase. Or third option, starting with a significant decrease. Or fourth option, we're missing it, something else. Just curious to hear the general direction people believe should be taken. I'll give it a few seconds. And we know this has always been a very heated discussion in previous adequacy reports, as well as the TONEP work we have. Nobody has a crystal ball, but expert judgment is often the best way for looking forward. I think we all look at the same reports for insights of what the future may give. We all take stock of recent developments and trends. Okay. So generally, I would say a soft majority at least saying we continue from current prices, which are fairly high compared to previous years, but we move forward with quite a steady or slow increase for the next years. Okay, we'll come back. We'll take note of that, and let's discuss it further in a moment, Christophe, when we say something about the assumptions for our ERA 2022. Without further ado, second question, we're still on the commodity price. Let's try to pick all 3 of them. Next commodity, gas prices. What are your expectations for the gas price trajectory in the coming decades? Again, trends, not trying to pin anyone down on a specific number. First option, slight drop in coming years, and then we rise again to at least the current high prices. Secondly, starting from current prices with a quite slow increase. Third option, starting from the current prices with a significant decrease. Fourth option, something else, unpredictable. And yes, of course, we started the work on the ERA 2022 already when the 2021 edition was being finalized. We scheduled this webinar several weeks ago. And of course, in recent weeks, I'm pretty sure our perspective on what future commodity prices may give have been shaken quite substantially. Okay. It's interesting to see that the majority of people say none of the above, something else. not sure if that means turbulence or if there's any specific source or recent published insight people think is the most steady, the most stable way to look at the future. Is there any specific view, if somebody would like to express what none of the above means, if there's any recent projection or any thought or line of thinking you think we should take into account, feel free to still add it in the Q&A box in the Slido app, of course. Okay, let us directly perhaps go to the third question still. For other fuel price trajectories, because we see a lot of discussion on gas and carbon, but of course there are multiple fuels we have to take into account in our era. What are your expectations for other fuel price trajectories in the coming decade? No specific price impact compared to gas and carbon, or which of the fuels do you believe will see substantial increase? Coal, oil, nuclear fuel, or something else? I'll give it again a few seconds for people to react. And I fully appreciate this kind of question rather deserves a debate than trying to pin people down on a multiple choice set of statements, but it's good to see a bit if there's some common trend. Significant increase for coal, at least 1/3 of the people indicate. And 1/3 believes no substantial impact, at least compared to gas and carbon. Okay, good to take stock of. Let us immediately take note of this and go to the next part of our presentation. And I would pass the floor to Christophe again to share some views on the possible approaches and pathways we could take in the ERA 2022, the suggestions the team has come forward with, and definitely appreciate views from everyone here, either directly in the Slido app or of course in the ongoing consultation, which you find on our website. Already reference was made to it earlier. We still have the opportunity to add insights or at least make reference to reports or recent studies you believe we should take stock of. Christophe, I hand over again to you. Thanks.
Thanks, Edwin. So indeed, some words on some key assumptions before diving into more methodological questions. This slide is probably already known especially by the people that joined the webinar last week on the main assumptions. So I won't spend a lot of time on those, but just to reiterate that, of course, if we perform an ERA, let's say 3 key types of assumptions here are listed on the slide, linked to input data, fit for 55, NECPs. Secondly, the climate. We all know that on adequacy, climate and weather conditions have an important impact. So there as well, what is taken into account for the ERA will have a significant impact on the results. And thirdly, interconnection. How to model cross-border interactions. I think Edwin said it in the beginning of the webinar. That with the evolutions in Europe, cross-border interactions remain all the more important, and therefore also the importance of correctly and realistically modeling this in the ERA will certainly not decrease. I'll keep it at that because this is not the focus of today. But let's take a further look into one of the important parameters to set or to take into account for the ERA exercise. And also one of the things where we got some feedback on in the public consultation, which is the choice of which target years you model. As you know, in the target methodology, of course, we are required to model every of those of the next 10 years. So as you are 2022 today, in the next ERA exercise, so it will be 2023 up to 2033, where every year should be modeled. Last ERA 2021, we took a start with modeling only 2 years, 2025 and 2030. And now, of course, for the next exercise in 2022, we want to, let's say, move on this trajectory towards the modeling of every single year. We want to double, let's say, the number of target years that are taken into account for the adequacy assessment. So what do we propose? First of all, we propose to keep the two years that were also considered in ERA 2021, being 2025 and 2030, for the same reasons. 2030 is of course a key year if we also look at the European policies, Fit for 55 and so on. 2025 is a year where indeed there's important changes throughout Europe regarding, for example, coal phase outs, for example, nuclear phase outs, and these kind of things. So those 2 years we propose to keep, and then to add 2 more years. First of all, a more short-term or mid-term, however you want to call it, year 2024, taking stock of the let's say the feedback that of course such kind of assessments, also the short term is quite important, because there the time to act is limited, which explains the reasoning to add also let's say a second short-term year. And then 2027, simply because this is 5 years ahead, and this was communicated to us to be an interesting year to look into, also in the framework of monitoring the operation of capacity mechanisms throughout Europe. So being quite still, let's say, arbitrary at the choice of target years, we think here we can strike a good compromise, a good set of target years to take into account for ERA 2022 on the trajectory, of course, to move to modeling every single year in the future. Next slide, please. Thank you. On the, let's say, the general framework, this basically is not intended to change significantly compared to ERA 2021. Also because, of course, this framework is described as such in the target methodology. So how do we intend to approach the full assessment? First of all, of course, as you know, we start with national estimates, so bottom-up collected data, for which today we have the public consultation and call for evidence running, with still let's say an update window in the next weeks, in case needed, if relevant, also given the recent events, of course, in the system and in Russia, Europe, Ukraine, to give an opportunity to member states or other parties to provide their comments in order to still have an update of these national estimate data if need be. After this, of course, this data will be used as a starting point, where first of all we will apply a central scenario without taking capacity mechanisms into account. So what does this mean? This means that we will run economic viability assessments throughout Europe, with the assumption that there's no capacity mechanisms in place providing for, let's say, additional subsidies, or providing for a means to cover the missing money in order to achieve the reliability standards of the different countries. No, this does not mean that, of course, units, capacities that today already received or have signed a contract in an existing capacity mechanism for a number of years, and these can be 1-year contracts, but also 8, 10, 15-year contracts, depending on the system. These contracts will, of course, be honored. We will, of course, assume even in the system where no new contracts will be awarded throughout Europe, the ones that are already awarded today will, of course, remain in place and will be taken into account in the economic viability assessment. And then thirdly, after this scenario, essential scenario without capacity mechanisms, we go one step further. And for the countries which already have a capacity mechanism in place approved by the European Commission, for those countries we could say correct or amend the economic viability assessment by, if need be, adding capacities in those countries in order to make sure that their reliability standard is met. which is in the end, of course, the final objective of in the market capacity mechanisms. So those are the the two central reference scenarios, starting all from the same basic input data. And next slide, please. Thank you. So jumping from the overall framework to, let's say, more concrete assumptions, which I think are very relevant to be discussed in the situation we know today. And we have seen in the last months since mid-2021 is, of course, on the assumption regarding fuel and CO2 prices. These are key assumptions, as you know, especially for the economic viability assessment that will be run in the framework of the ERA and will, of course, affect the final results of this economic viability assessment. Here on the slide, for your information, but I guess most of you are well aware of this, we've shown at the left side the CO2 or ETS price evolution in the last years and months in Europe, and on the right side the evolution of the gas price. For both of them, we of course see a very important evolution, not necessarily for the same reasons, of course. Gas prices explosion is much linked to the first to the COVID effects, and second, of course, also to the situation we know today in Ukraine. This being said, these markets, I think we all agree that they are currently very volatile, very uncertain. So it will be very difficult without having a crystal ball to have some kind of an estimation of how they will evolve in the weeks and months and years to come. But in the end, for the analysis that we'll do in the ERA, we will have to take some assumption. In the next slide, I will propose you how we intend to move forward. But of course, we welcome all your input, your feedback. Not necessarily, it can be on the specific values to use, but of course, even the more on the approaches or the principles to apply in order to set some reference values to be used for these parameters. So concretely, what do we propose to take? And I'm very pleased to have seen the outcome of the poll we just made, because I think personally that what we propose here is quite in line with what has been answered a few moments ago in the poll. So let's first take the CO2 price trajectory, because of course the two are quite different. I think on CO2 price evolutions in the recent years, we indeed saw the CO2 price increasing, but I think we have the assumption, or we think that this is more of a steady increase. It reflects the underlying evolution of the markets, and therefore for the CO2 price, what we propose is indeed to take this slightly increasing trajectory towards the future into account for the ERA. What are the exact values we propose to use? Those are mentioned or are indicated on the slide in the purple line and also with the purple dot. For 2030, we propose to use the CO2 price as indicated in the World Energy Outlook of IEA version 2021, which mentions this value of 110 euros per ton for 2030 in the announced pledges scenario. For the years in between 2022, between today and 2030, we simply propose to interpolate between today's prices and this estimated future price in 2030. For your reference, we also included on the slide in the blue dots the values that are being used in the framework of the TONDP scenario, national trend scenario. There, of course, it's to be noted that this exercise was started some time ago, and it was based also on the same source of IEA, but of course a version that dates some time ago, hence leading to these CO2 price assumptions that are quite low even compared to the values of today. On the gas prices, I think this is a bit different, of course. Here we estimate that today's gas prices are not necessarily reflective for the longer term future, because the drivers for today's gas prices are of course much linked to the situation we know today of the Ukrainian situation, also of the COVID effects still lingering. So what we propose there is to use the same source, also use the IEA to create a trajectory towards 2025 and 2030, where in the next years, 23, 4, 5, the current CO2 price, let's say, stabilizes, gas price, sorry, normalizes back to lower values, and then knows, let's say, a steady increase towards 2030. Just for a reference, the other dots we put on the slide, and just to give an idea of the order of magnitude of these prices, the orange, yellow, and green dots show today's future, so forward prices of gas for 2024, 25, and 26. Of course, there again, it's important to mention that these forward prices are quite volatile today, but I think in the end they also show this normalizing trajectory towards 24, 25, 26, in line with the purple trajectory that we propose for ERAA. I think that was my last slide, if I'm not mistaken. Can you go to the next slide? Yeah, indeed. So I'll keep it at that. I don't know if there's questions in the Slido on these topics already.
Thanks, Christophe, for sharing those views on what could be taken as assumption for various commodity prices, and of course also reflecting on the scenarios and the commodity and the target years still. The colleagues are still keeping track of the questions on Slido. I don't see any immediate reaction on the elements you have just mentioned, but I keep an eye. One of the colleagues tell me something came up. It seems not. I also want to just raise awareness that the colleagues are trying to answer the detailed methodological questions as much as possible on the fly in the Slido app as well. And we definitely plan to, after the webinar, report all received questions and try to answer them as much as possible. I see one question of a person asking if we're suppressing some statements. Just to be clear, no, I think it was a few questions which were answered already, which were taken out of the screen just for visibility. They're not being suppressed. Just to be clear, we will publish all the received questions and statements after the webinar and try to answer all the questions at least as well, if not already done on the fly during this webinar. Okay, just leaving a few seconds to see if somebody wants to react still on what Christophe had just presented on the target years and the commodity assumptions. Doesn't seem to be the case. Well, if it comes later still, we can always still come back to this topic, of course. Okay, then thanks, Christophe, for sharing the thoughts of the team on how to take those elements forward. And I would suggest we go to the next item of our agenda. Okay, before we dive into the modeling improvements, I don't know if we still want to take the Slido questions. Perhaps for the sake of time, it may be best if we simply immediately move forward. We were planning to at least probe some initial reactions from the people here joining us about some priorities, but I think it's good if we immediately dive into what you plan to share. Niels, thanks for joining us, about the elements the team is working on in terms of modeling. I would say everything besides the EVA, which we come back later in a moment ago. I'm pretty sure whatever we have to share, Niels, will definitely trigger some further questions and thoughts from the people here in our webinar. So I'm handing the floor to you, Niels. Thanks.
Cool. Thank you, Edwin. Can you confirm that you can hear me?
Loud and clear.
Great. Okay. So I will continue now with the modeling improvements that we are planning for ERA 2022. Most of them are tackling basically to have a more accurate modeling, modeling results and more accurate prices. There are 5 different topics that we are working on, and I will focus today on 4 topics of them, which are implicit DSR modeling, CHP heat revenue modeling, electrolyzers, and maintenance. There's also another topic, curtailment sharing. This will be presented in a separate webinar in May, as this is mainly concerning the flow-based simulation, and there will be a separate webinar for that. So I think you can go to the next slide, starting with the implicit DSR topic. So first of all, looking back into ERA 2021, what was done is that the consumption from the end consumers was mostly computed exogenously by a demand prediction tool. And this was based on historical demand profiles. And now what we are planning to improve in ERA 2022 is that for different technologies, we want to basically split the consumption into a share that include the time tariff and inflexible consumers, and a share which include the price tariff consumers. And these price tariff consumers are basically consumers which can react to market prices. So therefore, we also take them into account in our modeling tool, and we take into account their impact on the market price. On the other hand side, the consumer class of time tariff and inflexible consumers, they will still be computed by the demand prediction tool, so they are not included explicitly in the modeling tool. And there are 3 different technologies that we have identified where we do this split into price tariff and time tariff and inflexible consumers. And these are namely the small scale and household batteries, the heat pumps, and the electric vehicles. And for each of those technologies, we collect ratios, the price sensitive ratios by the TSOs. So it's a best estimate of the TSO for the different target years, to what extent we will have price sensitive consumers in these technologies in the system. And on the next slide, we have a description of the modeling that we are planning to have. Starting with the small scale and household batteries, we are planning that the price tariff share of those consumers can operate fully flexible in the system, of course taking into account their storage restrictions. So we have a quite similar behavior to large scale market participating batteries. The second category, the heat pumps, we still compute the base consumption exogenously in the demand prediction tool, but then in our market simulation and the optimization, the optimizer has the option to shift the demand within certain time windows of 4 to 6 hours, for instance, in case of scarcity or high prices. And similar approach is chosen for the electric vehicles. So again, we compute the demand of those electric vehicles exogenously with a demand prediction tool. And afterwards, the tool has the option to shift the demand of those electric vehicles if they are marked as price sensitive electric vehicles. It's also worth to mention that we do not consider vehicle to grid modeling yet this year. So this is the topic of implicit DSR. The next topic would be the CHP heat revenue modeling. Again, starting with a look back, what we did in ERA 2021. So basically, in ERA 2021, the CHP units were mostly marked by the TSOs as so-called must-run or policy units. and this implied that they could not be included in the economic viability assessment. And at the same time, due to their status as must-run units, they were also feeding into the system at zero cost. So we could not consider their actual marginal cost in the system. And the improvement in ERA 2022 here is that we don't have this must-run or policy unit status anymore by default. And therefore, the CHP units can also be included in the economic viability step, for instance, to be retired. So we have more retirement candidates. And at the same time, we also have more accurate prices in the system, because those units, those CHP units, will not anymore dispatch at zero cost, but they will rather dispatch at their marginal cost. And the way we model these heat revenues is shown on the next slide. Basically, the approach we have chosen is the so-called simplified heat credit approach. So we generate hourly heat credit profiles that reduce the marginal cost of each of the CHP units that we have in the system. And due to the lower marginal cost, we also have an increased likelihood to be dispatched, because those units are more on the left in the merit order. The heat revenue profiles are on an hourly base. So for each CHP unit, we have for every hour a certain heat revenue. And these heat revenue profiles are computed based on the annual heat production, the temperature profile, heating limits and heat prices, and power to heat ratios, which are all collected on a unit by unit base. The simplifications we are assuming here is that we, first of all, do not explicitly model the heat market. And we also do not have a requirement that the heat demand needs to be fulfilled on an hourly base. This is the simplification we assume here. You can go to the next slide, please. So I will proceed with the topic of the electrolyzers. This is also quite significant improvement we are planning to have here, because in the previous ERA study we did not include electrolyzers, and we have chosen an approach here that is aligned with the ENTSO-E scenario building team for the bottom-up scenarios. The assumption here is basically that electrolyzers are operating if the electricity price is below a certain threshold. And this threshold is derived from the price for hydrogen in the respective target year. So for instance, if we have target year 2030, this threshold will be around 49 euro per megawatt hour, which derives from the price for hydrogen and from the efficiency of the electrolyzer. So as you can see on the visual on the right, the typical behavior here would be that we have additional demand if the electricity price in the market goes below the threshold that is set. And for the next topic, this is the maintenance modeling, where we are also improving the way we do this. Basically, the improvement we are doing here is that we want to consider additional constraints in the optimization of the maintenance for thermal units, which can, for instance, represent certain restrictions, such as the availability of workforces to do the maintenance. So this is planned to be included this year, which was not included in the previous year, in terms of additional constraints. And also on top of that, we are planning to include the feed-in from renewables, in particular wind and photovoltaic, which was also not done in the previous study. So therefore, we are hoping to have, or we are expecting to have more adequate maintenance patterns as well. And what the outcome of the maintenance optimization will be is that the maintenance is usually scheduled in times of low residual demand, meaning that we have in those hours a high supply margin. And we also have the option for the TSOs to provide exogenous maintenance patterns. This is, for instance, done by the French TSO for the French nuclear fleet. If the thermal units have a very particular maintenance pattern, which cannot really be replicated in the optimization. So if this is done, if this is provided exogenously by the TSOs, we directly use those patterns for the different target years. This is about the maintenance optimization. And now I'm happy to answer any kind of questions about the different improvement topics.
Thank you, Niels. You covered quite a good spread of topics, and I hope it gives a good view, at least, even if it was a short summary about the plans of how to enrich the analysis for the next era. Definitely, some questions came in on what you just have presented. Simple question: do we publish the slides? Yes, of course we do. We publish the slides and the recording and everything we received as reaction via Slido, including answers on questions raised on what we presented, of course. Perhaps a few specific questions, which I think definitely are a reaction to what you presented just, Niels. In no particular order, but perhaps the first item you mentioned on implicit demand response, you mentioned 3 categories which are in the focus of improvement for ERA 2022 modeling. The question here is, why do we not assume part of the industrial load as price responsive during scarcities?
Yeah, this one I can answer. So mostly the industrial load is already included or has already been included in the ERA 2021 because it's more seen as explicit DSR. So these kind of big consumers, they are already included in the system, and they have also been included previously. However, now what we are improving this year is that we also want to include demand side response from end consumers, which are usually behind the meter, and usually we had not included them in the system.
Yeah. I believe we also come back on the topic of industrial demand response or explicit demand response later with the EVA, where they're one of the investment candidates being considered, of course. A few other questions which came up. You mentioned something again on the implicit DSR topic, Niels, about a ratio to be used for flexible versus inflexible consumers. A question I see here in Slido is, well, how is the ratio being chosen? Which are the arguments for that?
That's a good question indeed. It's a very difficult question to answer. So for now, we have collected these ratios from the TSOs, leaving them the freedom to choose the parameter or derive the parameter as they wish. But we're also planning to collect an overview about how these parameters have been defined, and in the future, in future ERA studies, also find an aligned parameter to derive those ratios.
Yeah.
Now, since it's the first time we apply this, we don't have yet a completely common base on this.
Yeah. Definitely, it's something which can definitely be further enriched in next editions. So for the moment, it's one parameter across Europe, correct? Or
it's TSO specific. However, we give TSOs the freedom to have their own rule how to derive those parameters. It can, for instance, be based on the smart meter rollout. I think it's very country specific settings. So it's difficult to have a common rule for that.
Yeah, definitely. And of course, if there's anyone else in the audience here who wants to react on that question, any good assumption or baseline or study to use for refining those assumptions, we of course welcome it. I cannot repeat it enough. I also see a question from one of our earlier presenters, Andres. Thanks for reacting again on the demand response topic. I'm not surprised it triggered you to react. You mentioned, Niels, indeed, that for the moment we're not considering any V2G in the modeling. Andres asked the question, why not take at least a percentage value? I think you mentioned 10% based on some studies. Appreciate to see which one you're referring to. But perhaps, Niels, you can address that, why we're initially considering not to include V2G yet for the up to 2030 timeframe.
Yep, I can answer on that. So we also had this discussion at the beginning, and we had some positions to include this. But the problem at the moment is that we have basically aggregated demand from electric vehicles for each country, and we don't really have the data for the different electric vehicles that are connected to the system. And if we want to really model also the feed-in back into the system, we need to have detailed data which electric vehicles we have and when each of the electric vehicles is connected to the grid. And therefore, for this year, we have decided to not include vehicle to grid, but I'm quite confident that this is one topic that will be tackled in the future to be included.
Yeah. Makes sense. I think it's also good to give this as a general view on how demand response is being tackled, because we have to be very clear about it. It's a comment we received quite often, the levels of demand response being assumed in the ERA. We got many reactions last time why it was low. People were expecting something higher. I think we got a very honest reaction from Smarten a moment ago. It's very hard to understand which is the actual potential in Europe, how they're being activated. It's really a balance we always have to strike. Do we assume in an ERA, which is an exercise meant to understand the adequacies of a system in a techno-economic sound way? Do you aim for a target, a market pool kind of dimension, or do you really take into account at minimum what we know will be there? Or do you take anything between those two levels? And I think when it comes to V2G, like you say, Niels, it's a bit the same understanding. We start from robust data. There are no doubt trajectories, targets, ambitions out there which go higher. But the question we receive quite often is, why don't we go for a more ambitious value? And it's a very fundamental question. What do you assume in an ERA, of course? And I would really ask anyone, again, invite everyone to respond to our call for evidence. But this is a returning question on every parameter we basically have in our assessment. If there is a spread between conservative and very ambitious optimistic, what do you assume in an ERA? Do you assume all of it, or where to set the right level? Okay, I hope with these few extra. Yes, Andres, sorry, go ahead. Yes.
Edwin, I will just take advantage of my presenter privileges. Just on going back on the V2G, I understand your reasoning very well, and it is indeed tricky. Next week, I will be able to give you a bit more feedback, because we're going to be modeling the participation, and we're going to be going into some assumptions of how that feeding in from the vehicles will work. So of course we don't have exact data for now, but in these modeling exercises you need to take assumptions. But just to point out that it is really, I think it would be a big miss if this is not represented somehow, because we're talking now 2032, this is in 2 generations of electric vehicles. So a lot of evolutions should be expected by then. More optimistic industry players, they're saying that this should be between 60 and 80% of vehicles providing V2G at that time. I'm not going that far, but I think that somehow it would be a big miss to not consider this capacity there. And I will get back to you next week with a more detailed on how we can include that.
Thanks,
cool,
Andreas.
thank you. Yeah.
Very valuable. Many thanks. Yes. Okay. Again, keeping monitoring the questions. We've quite a few rolling in. Perhaps to take one we have on the CHP approach. I know, Niels, you and the colleagues have been spending quite a bit of effort in trying to improve the CHP modeling for the next era. Question we see here is, wouldn't it be more accurately to assume that heat revenues will fill whatever revenue gap there is? Instead of retiring a CHP unit, the district heating network operator would simply raise the heat price.
So basically, what we try to achieve with our modeling approach is that we have the information about the heat supply from the different CHP units, and we basically assume that in the future those units still have to provide that heat, and they generate certain revenues from this. Based on that, we derive these patterns. But at the same time, the CHP units can also, for instance, be retired. So it can also be that the CHP units will be retired in the EVA, and then it's assumed that this is, for instance, being replaced by a unit that provide only heat to the system. I hope that answers the question.
Yeah. Okay, I know it has been discussed extensively, but there were good arguments to consider them still as an exit candidate in the EVA. But I understand that it's being questioned if somebody has sound arguments for why it should be reconsidered. If there are case studies about it, very valuable to receive those, of course. Okay. Quite a few questions are coming in. We'll definitely not be able to take them all during this webinar, but as said, we will definitely do an effort to get back to them in writing after the event. If I can perhaps take one which came in on the electrolyzer topic, and I'm just reading it on the fly together with you. An existing electrolyzer has to produce hydrogen in a high percentage of hours, I assume to be economically viable. Wouldn't it be better to model the electrolyzer as a set demand value that can be optimized into the best hours instead of waiting for a strike price? The question is basically, you presented, Niels, how we plan to model the flexibility of electrolyzers. Any value or what do you think is a challenge in modeling the dispatch of an, if I can call it like that, the dispatch, the operational mode of an electrolyzer in a more dynamic way?
I think, yeah, for us, the approach we chose is simply I would say the pure investor's perspective. If you look at the revenues you can generate from selling the hydrogen, we have a certain hydrogen price. So we try to, basically really model the behavior of the operator of the electrolyzer. And I think for that situation, it's reasonable that we have this feed in below a certain threshold, because if we have a fixed amount of hydrogen that must be procured, that must be produced, I think this will not be, I mean, there will be hours where the electrolyzer will be produced, possibly where it's not viable. So I think from that perspective, it's a more reasonable approach.
Yeah. Thanks, Niels. Okay. I'm definitely, I have to apologize for this. I don't think we'll be able to cover all questions on the spot now. We may still come back to some questions later on, but I definitely don't want to eat too much into the time of the next agenda item we have on the EVAs. Which I'm sure will also trigger quite a few questions, and I don't want to drag anyone into this 3-hour webinar going over time beyond 5 o'clock. So thank Niels for sharing those improvement ideas of the team here. Thanks also for still staying around for any questions which come later. And I would suggest that we move on to the next item of the agenda. Perhaps, yes, Anita, we had still a few polling questions prepared to you. Perhaps let's still at least take one of them. If you would go to the Slido app, just a burst of inspiration. I assume everyone here in the webinar knows very well what the EVA, the Economic Viability Assessment, is about. One of the engines, one of the main improvements compared to earlier adequacy assessments, is embedding of entry and exit candidates into the scenarios set forth initially. Christophe already shared a few ideas up front, or a synthesis of what we heard from many people about how the EVA should evolve for the ERA 2022. Just a burst of inspiration, free text. If you go to the Slido app to the poll tab, what modeling improvements would you consider as a priority for the economic viability assessment in the ERA? Multi-year. I know Yvon also had it in I think in the green box on top of his last slide. Consistency of the EVA and economic dispatch, 30-year time frame, CHP revenues. Scarcity pricing. I do acknowledge there were a few questions coming in a moment ago about whether we should believe or not believe in scarcity prices. I know I don't want to enter into a very fundamental discussion here about how that could look like. I see it more as statements, and I can only phrase it as a question we just had in the discussion with Yvon. For the purpose of an ERA, what do you best consider as a cap price or a dynamic cap price in the ERA assessment? We come back to the topic anyway in a moment, but appreciate any view on that. I see risk aversion. We just had the same, of course, suggestion from Dimitri. It would be interesting, of course, to understand how to take it into account in an actual EVA methodology. Consistent input data. Risk appetite again. Yeah, okay. And multi-year definitely coming out of it as in big headlines. Thanks for setting the scene for the discussion. I'm pretty sure those topics also come up in the next agenda item. I would say, without further ado, let's go into that. There is a few elements which are being highlighted by my colleague Yasser about how we want to approach the economic viability assessment in the ERA 2022. We took stock of our own learnings in the ERA 2021. Priorities also received from the consultation process, and an interesting menu has been set forward about how we want to enrich the EVA for this ERA. So Yasser, I pass the microphone to you. Thanks for guiding us through these ideas the team is working on. You're muted, Yasser. We do not hear you. I do not hear you. I hope you can make it work. Seems to be a small glitch. No, sorry, it still doesn't work, Yasser. I don't know if any of the colleagues close to him are able to fix it.
Can you hear me?
Now we hear you. Yes, Yasser.
Okay.
Loud and clear. Loud and clear.
There's a small
Okay.
button here. It's,
Okay. Please go ahead and let's dive
sorry
into the
for
topic.
this. Thank you very much, Elvin. Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Yasser Touhidi from ENTSO-E. So I'm going to I heard there's an echo.
I hear you fine, Yasser, without any issues. So please go ahead.
Okay. Yes, sorry for this. So EVA, Economic Viability Assessment, and as you are all familiar, is an
I hope it's being fixed, Yasser. If you can try again. Yasser, can you try? Okay, no. I think we're facing a bit of interference with the colleagues nearby. No, this seems to be a... No, we don't hear you, Yasser, sorry.
Okay, a little bit change of.
This works fine, and I hope for everyone. I hear you, no echo. Please dive into it. Thanks.
Yes, so EVA is on a step in ERA, for which we want to do an economic viability assessment. So yeah, so we want to, in scenario without CM, without capacity mechanism, we want to look at the revenues of our generation resources when we consider them in the short-term economic dispatch. Okay. Yeah. So we have a large model. Let's say that at one side we have these long-term entry and exit decisions. We want to see the economic viability of generation resources, existing one, whether they remain in the system or the new candidates, whether they it's economically viable for them to come to the system. And at the other side, we want to look at these revenues on the short-term economic dispatch with all the uncertain uncertain conditions that we have here. So you can see that we have a computational complexity here at the long-term and exit decisions. We want to keep this as not extensive as possible, let's say, as limited as possible, because this is these long-term decisions makes the decision making makes the model large. And at the other side, on the short-term economic dispatch, we also have, as I said, a lot of uncertainties, and we could reduce the burden of the model on that side. For example, playing on the granularity of the model or reducing the uncertain conditions. Before going more to the topics of EVA for today, I would like to just bring in all the stuff, let's say, that we have in our model we have to consider. So we have bidding zone reviews, bidding zones in our model, which we have cross-border capacities between them. These cross-border capacities are, of course, NTC or flow-based. They are considering all the security roles and N-1 conditions. Apart from that, we have the installed generation resources from that we collect from national estimates. Yeah, so installed generation resources in the target years that we are going to analyze. On top of that, we have in this data the planned outages of generation resources. In addition to that, we collect any other information regarding capacity mechanisms, whether there is existing contract or a policy contract or any type of must-run trajectory. We have climatic scenarios or climatic conditions, which is the uncertainty we are dealing with in EVA. These climatic conditions for us are are demand variations for different climatic conditions and renewable generation for these climatic conditions. Apart from all of this, which forms the whole, let's say, the existing infrastructure and what we have in the model, we have to consider other economic parameters. For example, cost of capital. For new investments, we have to consider fixed costs of existing and new generations, and of course, as previously was covered by Christoph, fuel and CO2 prices. On top of that, we have a price cap, which is kind of the last step of our model when we want to include how much is the demand utility, let's say, in the model. So this is our latest offer, let's say, in the market, and that is spelled out in the price cap in our model. We have also WACC, which includes risk. So WACC consists of two parts. One is a risk-free part, which is the same for all the technologies, and we have a risk premium depending on technologies, whether they are making profit on the very high price spikes, let's say, or so very volatile states. So the marginal units are having, of course, higher risk premium. Apart from these economic parameters, of course, we have to have we have to consider other assumptions. For example, how long we are going to plan. I saw that 30 years was raised as the answer to the questions. So we have to decide what is the planning horizon that we are focusing. Yes, so we have these target years in ERA 22. So we are going to focus on these target years this year. And we have to decide what are the standard technologies. So what are these new candidates that are going to compete on their economic viability with the existing generation resources. And we have other revenue streams to take into account. For example, the heat revenue that we are going to consider this year, and it was presented by Niels. Yes. So this in this presentation, we are going to focus on the topics that you see. These are not all the topics that we are investigating on in ERAA. So we have a stepwise approach for implementing the ERA methodology and EVA part. So we focus on our most important priorities this year, which are the decision variables. So what are these market entry and exit decisions, which is the multi-year aspect. So how long is our horizon, and how we are going to deal with the decision making in a multi-year dynamic, let's say. And then, as I said, we have climatic year selection, yes. So for all the climatic conditions we have, how we are going to select in order, how we are going to reduce this number in order to deal with the computational difficulties that this model has. These are the methodological aspects that I'm going to discuss with you. Apart from that, we have some data assumptions. Our cost assumptions for generation resources, our cost assumption potential for DSR, the carbon and fuel prices was covered already, and what we are going to set as the price cap. I will start with the EVA decision variables. So in this table, you see all our decision variables that we are going to include in this round of EVA. So for the standard technologies or the technologies that we consider expansion as a candidate in our model, it's gas as last year and DSR, and we are going to include batteries this year as a new technology. For decommission of existing units, we are going to include all the thermal units, so gas and lignite, coal, and oil. And these are also the technologies that we are going to consider for mothballing and demothballing or life extension. These two last considerations are again new decision variables that we consider this year. Just to mention that the reason we are not including renewables in EVA is that these resources are mostly driven by subsidies and member state policies. And also, apart from that, the costs and potentials are site specific, and it's so it's better that we rely on the national estimates at least for this round of EVA on their best estimates on these renewable resources in our target years. I would like to mention that when we say all these decision variables, it doesn't mean that all of the units with these technologies are considered. Of course, we collect this data from TSO, so if there is a restriction, these are all included. Apart from that, we would like to mention that, especially on the cost of mothballing and demothballing or life extension, we would welcome stakeholders' feedback on our call for evidence on 5th of April. Okay.
Thanks, Yasser. If I may interrupt you, sorry, very briefly, because I know you have to go through a lot of, you want to go through a lot of topics. It's all EVA, but it's also always a bit of a different category of items. It's good to pick up the questions when they come in already. There is at least one question which was triggered by actually the previous chart you made when you more or less sketched the complexities of the modeling. You mentioned at some point must-run trajectories were taken into account. Yeah, as you say, it comes indeed from the data collection we do with all our TSOs based on very clear guidance and quality checks. But there's a question still: which type of technology is included in must-run trajectories, which it doesn't create any risk? Can you perhaps shape a bit of a better understanding of what these kind of units or trajectories typically include? Anything you can do to clarify this item? Thanks.
Thank you very much for the question. Yeah, so one type of these must-run trajectories are indeed the CHPs. That still we keep this option of having must-run trajectories instead of including CHPs for EVA if deemed so on the data collection. But these must-run trajectories could be could have different reason apart from heat demand. Yeah, I mean this could be the TSO's requirement for security. They want to keep these trajectories for yeah different reasons of operation.
Exactly. It goes indeed beyond the CHP category. Yes. Okay. Yes. Thanks. I see no other question coming in on what you just mentioned about the investment candidates. Okay, and one question coming in still. Let's take it now. Question still, I think it was a bit triggered about the investment candidates when you said renewables are not considered yet, as you said, because they're mainly subsidy and policy driven. Is risk curtailment assessed under different scenarios? Because it has an implication in EVA for renewables and can have implications on the viability of storage. Can you say anything about risk curtailment and how they're being modeled?
Yes, indeed, if there is extra rest generation, it's curtailed. But worth mentioning that as Niels said, we have this year these electrolyzers that can let's say start as a demand and let's say use this generation of renewables instead of curtailment. But apart from that, yes, if there is extra generation of renewables, it's curtailed the model.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. Okay, please, Jasper, dive into the next item.
Yes, so multi-year. So last in EVA 2021, we focused on one single year. We are going to extend this to have a multi-year EVA. This, of course, is the most important item for our analysis for our improvement, let's say this year. But we also know that this is also the most computationally complex part. So for this reason, we are investigating different options as we are in course of developing the model and doing the final simulations. Our main focus is our option one, which is a stochastic model, a multi-year stochastic model. This is a heavy model, of course, and due to that, we have to limit the number of climatic conditions that we consider in this option. However, if you are able to run this with sufficient climatic conditions, then we don't need to do any post-processing, and in one shot we have the final result of market entry and exit decision. However, since this is a heavy model, we are also investigating another multi-year model again, but only focusing on climatic years, each climatic year separately. Okay, so we have a multi-year for one climatic condition, then we have multi-year for another climatic year condition. This is a moderate model. The multi-year model is not as heavy as a stochastic model, of course, but still it's a large model. But for this one, we could increase the number of climatic conditions that we consider. But of course, since we have a multi-year decision for each climatic years, then we have to do then we have to do some post-processing on these results per climatic condition. We also keep as a fallback the more or less similar approach that we had last year on a single year deterministic approach. So here, this is not a multi-year anymore. So we just let's say analyze each year separately, but with the advantage, let's say, of having the possibility of looking at this result on higher number of climatic year conditions. So the result of this fallback solution is per climatic year and per target year, and of course some post-processing is also needed. For example, averaging is also needed in this part. I would like to mention that this option 2 and fallback, the post-processing of these two could also help each other, right? So this heuristic, let's say, post-processing that we're going to do for these two approaches, yeah, we have to see how we are going. Maybe some forward and backward movements between target years or climatic conditions are needed for these two approaches. But as I said, we are aiming to have a stochastic multi-year approach depending on our computational feasibility. Edwin, if you don't want to.
No, I'm also keeping track of the questions we see
Okay.
coming in, but I don't see any immediate reaction. So, I mean, in summary, Yasser, you're saying we all understand the left one is the ideal one of the three options, but at least we have to be honest about if it doesn't end up in robust or realistic results, we might have to, for the moment, go for a fallback solution. But definitely, option one is the preferred one of those three. But I would still frame the question to anyone listening in here. I think it goes without saying that the stochastic multi-year approach, it tries to capture as much as possible into how an investment decision could be put forward. I know also in the beginning of our webinar, Dimitri presented several other elements which have to be taken into account. But as always, are we looking at the right angles? Because just to emphasize what Yasser has been saying, this takes a lot of effort to really get this model running appropriately correct. And as always, you're presenting a lot of things here, Yasser, about improvements we are considering. Which one is really the most important one? I know when we asked the question a moment ago in the poll, multi-year just jumped out of the screen as the biggest one. I would still ask people to take stock of everything that we are sharing here today, and anything we haven't discussed explicitly, what is really essential to have a realistic EVA if choices have to be made. But okay, thanks. And even with that said, okay, and my few minutes of filling at least triggered one question. Let me just take that one, Yasser. So a question on option one, you say a limited number of climatic conditions. But then you say a single result. Does that mean you will only do one climatic year?
No. So what we mean here in a stochastic model is that we build a multi-year model with a limited number of climatic conditions, but all in one single model. So you don't have the result per climatic condition, right?
So multiple climatic years, one outcome looking over all of them. But
exactly.
To keep it reasonable, you cannot have hundreds of climatic years. That's basically what we're saying. Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Yasser. Let's go to the next one.
Yes, climatic year selection is the next topic, which goes hand in hand, as you saw previous slide, with the multi-year aspect of EVA. I will just go through these two methodologies for climatic year selection. On the left is the approach we used last year, and on the right is the approach we are proposing. We're going to use for this year. So last year, the clustering of climatic years, climatic conditions was based on residual load of macro regions. So the whole Europe is divided to some macro regions, for example, Scandinavian countries, Baltic countries, Central Western Europe countries, and the residual load of these macro regions is calculated considering the load, wind, hydro flow, etc. And then if you want to select a number of climatic years, for example, 3 climatic years, all the combinations of these climatic conditions are investigated, and the mean and variance with respect to the aggregated distribution is calculated, and the best and the best combinations with respect to the aggregated distributions are selected. On top of that, so first you filter on based on the mean and variance of aggregated distribution, and then on the selected, let's say 100% of all the combinations, there is another step to avoid having mild selection of climatic conditions or extreme selection of climatic conditions by minimizing the distance to the k-means of each cluster, selecting the climatic year, which has the minimum distance to the k-means of each cluster, as you see in the graph below. So you see both of these steps are sort of avoid having the extreme scenarios, the climatic conditions, which are outliers, let's say, in the final steps. So we are going to investigate another approach this year, which is better fit for our purpose and also keeps this extreme climatic years, which is on the right figure. So we are going to select climatic years based on the total cost, consisting of fixed costs and operation costs, when we consider the optimal fleet of different climatic conditions on the others. So for example, here you see the distance between the two climatic years, climatic year 1 and climatic year 2. The distance between climatic year 2 to climatic year 1 is when you change the optimal fleet of climatic year 1 and put the optimal fleet of climatic year 2, but you still solve the climatic year 1, the third bar, the third column. Yeah. Okay. And if you find the distance of your total cost when you compare it to the climatic year 1 with the optimal fleet of itself, that is the distance between climatic year 2 to climatic year 1. And then we have the distance between climatic year 1 to climatic year 2. So the other way around for climatic year 2. And these two parameters together form the final distance between the two climatic years. So all these distances will be calculated and the climatic years will be clustered based on these distances, and according to your final decision of how many clusters, how many years you want. So for example, 3, 5, 7 or more, your climatic years are clustered and selected. We think that this is a better fit for our purpose of EVA.
Thanks, Yasser. So in short, it's much more robust compared to what you said on the left chart, where sometimes or there was a risk that if extreme climatic years could have been avoided, but the right one is definitely more robust. I see one question coming in about how the macro regions are being selected. Just to clarify, Yasser, that was an element of the approach of last year, but in the new approach you're suggesting, there's no need to use macro regions anymore, correct?
Yes. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. And if anyone was interested still in how it was done last year, you find all the explanation, of course, in the report of last year. And I hope people can value the improvements considered for this EVA 2022 on how to select climatic years. Okay, as I see no further questions coming in on the climate year selection, they may still come later, of course. Let's go to the next topic, Yasser.
Okay, so from this part, I will dive more into the cost assumptions. So last year we used the harmonized values for capex and FOM from European reference scenarios. But since ERA methodology goes hand in hand with Wall and Kone methodology, and it's explicitly mentioned that we have to use the Kone values if available. We decided to go this way this year. So we are going to use the values we collected from the Wall and Kone studies in the member states that they have published these values. So far we have from Germany, Belgium, Estonia, Germany, Italy, and Sweden. Of course, member states have used different technical specifications. You will see in the next slide. So we need to do some harmonization. Also, not all the countries publish the Kone assumptions. So, for example, Germany they just publish the Kone fix and not the specific parts of this value. Also, not all countries consider DSR and report its potential, which is another standard technology that we consider and we need the data for. And of course, we know that when you have these different considerations per member states, this affect the EVA results. But anyways, that's perhaps indeed the goal of having these two methodologies going hand in hand, and having a view on capacity mechanisms and reliability standards. So, and for the for the member states where no Kone study was published, we will use an average value based on the available ones. In the next slide, you can see a collection of the data regarding our standard technologies and the values we collected from different Kone studies. As you see, there are different, sometimes there are different values for different technologies, and we have to perhaps do some harmonization later on. And also you see that DSR was not a standard technology in Estonia and Italy. These are not the standard technologies of these countries. These are only the standard technologies that we consider in our methodology. Of course, some member states have other standard technologies which were not reported here because these were not the ones we wanted to continue to include. For example, Greece has CHP as a standard technology, and or Italy has pumped storage. Yes, for battery also there are different assumptions on the type of the battery, whether it's a 1 hour battery, 2 hours battery, 3 hours battery, etc. Yes, and as you see in the case of Germany, as I said before, yeah, the capex and FOM specifically is not provided, but the total Kone fix is reported.
Thanks, Yasser. I see no immediate reaction on what you said. In summary, we take stock of the existing studies on cones, of course, and volts, and we fix the gaps where no better information exists, of course. Okay, one question: can you elaborate a bit on what you mean by harmonization of cone values? I think you mentioned averaging. I'm not sure where we mentioned harmonization.
So, for example, in the case of batteries, I would say we as I said, we don't want to increase our standard technologies, our candidates. We want to keep it limited. So for battery, we are going to start only with 1 hour type of battery. And then we see in Belgium that there is 2 hour type of battery reported, and as you see, the fixed cost, the capex cost is reported 0, and all of these fixed cost is actually put as fixed cost. So these changes are changes in the initial assumptions are existing in these different studies, and we need to do some harmonization.
Yeah, I think the point is it's not harmonization, but it's filling the gaps by taking in a reasonable averaging or interpolation, or take best available information from where it is available and use it for parameters in countries where there is no national report on these elements, of course. Thanks, Yasser. Okay, for the sake of time, let's perhaps move on to the next topic, and if we still have time at the end, we can come back to a few questions we keep collecting.
Yeah, the next item is DSR, which is actually related on the previous one. So for DSR, on top of the capex and FOM, we need to have the potential of investing DSR, different types of DSR in our model. So for this, again, we take the same approach. So we are going to use the values published in Kone poll studies were available, the capex, FOM, and potential of DSR. However, since as you saw in the previous slide, not all the countries provide this, and we have limited information. We have limited countries that they have done the Kone study. We are going to use any other national study if we have a comprehensive data on this capex, FOM, and DSR potential. We will consider them. Otherwise, our fallback for the countries that these studies are not available, we will use a simplified bottom-up approach as we have done last year. If I can continue.
I think you can, Yasser, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, I don't see any major reaction to that.
Okay.
Thank you.
So yes, so carbon and fuel prices were covered, and I jump now to the price cap. So what we put as the price cap in our simulation, which is an important parameter and affects the economic viability of units, especially the marginal units that make profit mostly on these hours of with high prices. So price cap exists on the market due to regulation, and basically the reason behind this regulation is that yes, so demand does not actively, let's say, declare its prices, its utility function, and that means that that price can go well above what most consumers are willing to pay, and that's why the regulator puts this price limits to protect market actors. The day ahead price cap is 3,000 for Europe at the moment, and this market, the day ahead market, is the market that most transactions and most energy is delivered, and we are going to consider this price cap in our model. However, there is a regulation that this price cap can go up when the price exceeds 60% of this cap, and the cap increases 1,000 with effect of 5 weeks later. So this is the regulation. So if you want to include, if you want to implement this, of course you have to have this dynamic increase in price cap in our model, but we are not going to make our model as complicated, of course, for obvious reasons. However, for this year, we are going to, let's say, forecast price cap increases before final simulation and use that price cap for EVA. How we are going to do that? We are going to simulate a multi-year consecutive years under different climatic year conditions, and then we will see if we consider this rule of increasing 60%, increasing 1,000 when the price reached 60%, what would be the new price for our for each target year in each of these scenarios? And finally, we compute this new price in our target years, this average price that we get in our target years as our input, as our price cap that we consider in our model.
Thank you, Yasser. So yeah, as you say, the real dynamic price cap, it's still the ambition. We're still looking into that of how to implement it. And at least there's a good, very pragmatic approach of how to somehow come close to what that would actually mean for the EVA model via this post-processing approach, and then feeding it into as a new price cap into the model. Okay, one question coming up. How are you going to consider that the price cap in the intraday markets is close to 10,000 euros per megawatt hour?
Yeah, thanks for the question. As I said, so our assumption here is that, as I said, the wholesale market happens mostly in the day-ahead market, and that is the way. If you look at the generation market, entry and exit decisions in the long term, that is the market that they are focusing to get revenues. The intraday market that follows this day-ahead market, let's say, these are all the variations that are happening to the load during these hours, and the energy is transacted based on these variations. Some units get perhaps lose or gain, but as I said, the 80% is of transactions happen on day-ahead market, approximately, and 20% on intraday market. So that is why, we focus on the day. Yeah,
we focus on the I would call it the mimic price of the reference market. Indeed, the day ahead price. Intraday at the moment less liquid. Who knows? At some point it may become the reference market, of course. But appreciate, of course, views from anyone else here in the audience if people believe another segment should be considered for the reference prices here. Okay, good. With those few additional seconds, I didn't see any additional question coming in yet. Okay, then I thank you, Yasser, a lot for your contributions here in this webinar. Of course, the whole team has been working on these improvements for the ERA 2022. Thanks a lot for that. I can understand it also requires a bit of digestion by people to come back to with views, with feedback, with additional thoughts. But I would like to take the opportunity at least also to slowly wrap up the webinar here today. We're close to 5 o'clock anyway. This has been a very intense and fruitful discussion. Thanks to everyone for the many comments and questions posted also via the Slido app. As said earlier, we will definitely publish the slides, the recording, and the full set of reactions shared on the Slido app after this webinar. And to all the questions on the approaches taken by ENTSO-E, we'll do an effort to respond to them. In any case, I also remind everyone of the broader process we're doing on the ERA 2022. As highlighted by my colleagues earlier already, we still have an open consultation phase on which we had a webinar last week, which focuses on the scenarios for ERA 2022, including some additional key assumptions like commodity prices, like Christophe had mentioned earlier. We still will invite anyone to take a look at those data sets. and the qualitative questions we posed in that consultation phase and that call for evidence. We put out the approach of how we believe the ERA 2022 can be set in motion. If anyone sees any evidence, any report, any recent statement from an authority which could lead to belief that better estimates can be taken, please do share it with us. I appreciate if you can receive it by 5th of April. At that time, we'll take stock of all the input and get the machine going to the bulk of the analysis for the ERA 2022, including all its methodological improvements we have just mentioned. We definitely appreciate any further views anyone wants to share with us after today. At minimum, there will be an additional workshop planned for about in 2 months' time in May. I think Niels already made a quick reference to that. We want to share some thoughts on where we are in the flow-based methodology for the ERA itself, including the additional elements it takes, like curtailment sharing. And we'll take stock, of course, of reactions we get from all of you. If any other topic deserves to be put on the agenda, then any feedback we got in this call for evidence, we'll definitely make sure it's a valuable event as well. On the slide, it's still said that in May it's going to be a webinar. I keep my fingers crossed. I hope we're going to be able to make it a physical event as well. Probably it will be somewhat hybrid, but at least I hope we also have a chance to discuss face-to-face with some of you how this ERA can be a valuable product going forward. So again, let me first conclude by thanking all the contributors to today's webinar. First and foremost, of course, the external speakers who kindly offered to share some thoughts on the previous ERA and the possible ideas for the next ERA. Many thanks, Yvon, Dimitri, and Andres for your presentations, for your preparations, and for taking part in the discussion today. We look forward to staying in touch with you. And you all mentioned some upcoming work you're working on. We definitely look forward to seeing more of that. Thanks also to the ENTSO-E colleagues who presented and behind the scenes did a lot of work in recent months to kick this ERA 2022 in motion. So we very much look forward to engage further with all of you in the coming months while we aim for an ERA 2022 by November this year. Thanks all for joining us today, and we'll hope to be in touch with all of you soon. Have a good day. Bye-bye.